Hey everyone, so this is part two of our little mini-series of Hashem and the Big Bang, trying to sort of deal with the questions of creation, science, and religion, and Torah, and sort of like just trying to destroy what I said in the first part is kind of like the straw man idea that there's even any kind of conflict, there was ever any kind of conflict between Torah and science. And so what we really sort of so far what we covered was just kind of explaining how the word yom in the Torah doesn't really mean day, and it really kind of means epochs or phases or units of time, and each one sort of has like a little bit of a different nature or signature that makes it kind of more unique. That's why they're divided into these stages. Each stage is kind of specific. And so what we're going to talk a little more about now is just how to see a little more deeply like what exactly we mean when we talk about Hashem sort of working with time. Because again, the assumption that we always have is like, if assuming that you actually think that the creation story in Parshas Bereshis in Genesis is actually literally talking about days, so then you start running into all these problems in terms of time, just because, well, it sounds like there were 6 days, each one was 24 hours, and then we have a few thousand years since then. And then, of course, science seems to indicate there are many, many more years besides just those 6 days and 5,000 years. So we have to sort of analyze time a little carefully, and then we also have to analyze Hashem a little carefully. And I want to sort of really delve now into Hashem's relationship with time, because I think that's really where the problems start here. And so in order to do that, let's just remember and realize exactly who we are in the story that we're talking about here, because we tend to think of ourselves as, well, we have like understanding of the universe, and we are characters who are part of the universe, and Hashem is also a character in the universe, and we kind of are, we're like looking at him and we're like, well, Hashem, how does this work? Or like it says you did it in 6 days, but we have 15 billion years, and we have like understanding, so we want to figure this out, like where does this belong? And I just want to sort of make it a little clearer here for a second that like you and Hashem are not operating in the same plane in a certain kind of way. And I don't just mean that in like well, he's God, so like he's so great, and so therefore like you just can't understand. I don't mean that at all. I mean in a very specific way, you and the character in the Chumash that we call Yud Kei Vav Kei Elokim, also known as Hashem, also known as God, whatever word you want to use, but the words of the Torah are very specific when they describe him. So you and Hashem are really fundamentally operating in very different ways, and we have to understand the ways that Hashem is operating to get sort of how he relates and works with time. So let's just remember, first of all, that you operate within time, and that means that like you could think of it as, if you imagine like a movie screen. So a movie screen is basically like the space where a movie, the colors and the pictures are projected and are played onto the screen. So the screen is the space where the characters in the movie have room to do what they're doing, to move from point A on the screen to point B on the screen, and all that movement takes place on the screen. No one ever leaves the screen, because outside of the screen, there's no longer space for the movie. So there's the concept of the movie does not exist anymore. So that's essentially what the universe is in terms of space for us. It's like a 3-dimensional movie screen, and then you essentially move around inside of it, and you can go from point A to point B within space. So that's just an analogy of how to understand the space of the universe. And then you kind of add on top of there's the concept of time. So in the movie screen analogy, so the time is essentially that's the measure of the changes themselves as they take place on the screen. So for example, you might say, well, how much time does it take for a series of changes on the screen to happen? Now, if you don't have any time to measure, if time is not a dimension that you can use to measure things, so then you have no way of actually having any change take place on the screen, right? If time just stopped, then the movie screen would just freeze and there would be no change taking place. So what time does is it gives you this way of measuring the actual changes that take place on the screen when things move from point A to point B. And in fact, if you think about it a little more carefully, just in general, we take time as a complete given. That just, we have time. Time is just something that's here. But time is actually a dimension that you move through. In other words, you could think of time as the measure of the changes that take place as you change within space. So if you are sitting in one place and you move to another place, so then time is the measure of the change In other words, like how much change. So you think about, like, let's just to think about what a clock is for a second. So a clock is simply something which changes its shape, literally moves parts of itself through space in a relatively consistent way. And those changes, we use those to measure essentially rhythm changes in time. So it's like we make the clock move in a very consistent pace. It moves 1, 2, 3 in seconds. And then every second we say, okay, that's another second of time. So we arbitrarily assign essentially, some kind of numbers to the process of change within space. That's what time actually is. Time is simply our measure of the changes taking place within space. So when you start to realize that a little bit, think about that a little carefully. So all that time really is, it's kind of just like this. It's like this background. It's this medium. It's kind of like if you were in a swimming pool, so you're inside of the water, so the water is just the medium that you're kind of moving through. So time is like this thing that we just use to measure the changes in space, and time is what we're moving through as we are shifting places in space. So if you're going from one place in space to another place in space, and time wasn't working anymore, you would have no way to go from one place to another because there is no time to move through. You need to have this extra dimension to move from point A to point B because it doesn't happen instantaneously. Those changes essentially unfold in this other dimension that we call time. Now, the more you think about that concept, the more profound it becomes. I mean, we have an easier time understanding space because you can sort of see space. It's like you look around, your senses, your eyes and your ears. I mean, all of sound operates within space, and you can see all this, all these things around you that essentially form space. And even that's very profound, because when you think about it in terms of the movie screen analogy, so a character in a movie screen, if they would be aware that they're only in a movie, and that they're just a projection onto a screen, so they'd kind of be like, whoa, how do I leave the screen? And it's a kind of a disturbing thought process because there's nowhere for them to go. They can't leave the screen. And similarly with space, you start running into these problems where you try to think, well, what's outside of space? But you can't leave space because the whole idea of leaving implies that there is a place here and a place that's not here, and I want to leave this place and now go to another place. That's leaving this place. And the idea of place only exists inside of space. So you can't even leave space. It's not possible to do that because the concept of leaving does not apply outside of a space context. So there's no way to do that. So that's a little bit profound, but like you can kind of get a feel for space just by sort of seeing it, and we are just sort of used to space in that sense. But time is a completely different type of thing because you can't really see time, and even as you can't see it, you're constantly moving through it. Even as I'm talking, so there's like an unfolding of changes within space, and that unfolding is literally the meaning of time. It's the measure of the change of what takes place in space. There's no other expression of what time is. You could think of time as just, on the clock, or just what day it is or what year it is, but all that time really genuinely is a measure of particular changes. So we use different kinds of measures. An example would be we measure what we call a day is measured by the change of the Earth's rotational position relative to the sun. So a day is measured as, well, there's the daytime and the nighttime, and then so as the Earth rotates, so it's now changing position, and so we kind of measure the frequency of that position, and we say we're going to call that a day. So, and then you think of things like a year is the same exact thing. A year is the movement of the Earth positionally all the way around the sun, not just in terms of its rotational relationship, in terms of its actual spatial relationship, where in relation to the sun is it, in relation to other planets. And there's also galaxy swirls like that, incidentally. In other words, you can also measure time in terms of the large movement of our solar system through the entire galaxy as it rotates around the core of the galaxy. And these are all just ways to measure the changes within space with regularity with this thing that we call time. But if you think about it, in a certain way, time is not even really a thing. It's just a measurement of change within space. And yet, we think of it as an entity, and it's very, very, significant. So when you start pulling yourself back from time in that way, you start to realize that maybe time had this very overblown place inside of your mind as an entity, as an object almost. There's this thing called time. And instead, you start to realize and pay attention to the truth of what time is, that it's actually just the unfolding of changes within space, and then this weird thing. It's like I forget what, maybe it was Einstein that has a line about how the past is kind of like, if you think of it like a river. So the past is still there, just up the river. It's behind, and right now we're going down the river, so we're the river is unfolding in front of us, and the past is still back there somewhere. And so you're kind of like, well, but where exactly is the past? If you try to point to that, the past isn't in. It's not like you point behind you, like as if time, just like space. There's behind me in space, so I think there's behind me in time. But the past is not in another place. It just kind of like, as I sit here, the past of the beginning of this video is already in the past, and we unfolded time to be in this situation that we're in now, where I'm speaking about this, and it's just this very bizarre, inexplicable phenomenon that we all experience, and we're sort of wired to move through this medium called time, and we view it as if it actually exists as a thing, but it really, in a very real sense, doesn't. So when you start to pay attention to that, so that already starts to reduce some of the dependency on the idea that, well, there's this thing called time, and there's days, and days are a thing. We know there are days. Like, when you start to think bigger, you start to realize that days are not a thing. Our fixation on days as being the amount of time that they are is very, very subjective. It's very relative. It's like that's just been our experience, and we're so used to measuring days and nights and time and years, and we're just very in our own lives. That's we have distorted perspectives because we're so attached to what we're used to in terms of these structures of thought and structures of experience. But this is not the reality of the cosmos and of the galaxy and of our solar system and of the which is all the world that Hashem designed. All this is these are the laws of time and space and physics that Hashem wove into reality. So we think about it in a very, very small way compared to how Hashem thinks about it. Let's just take a slightly bigger example now. So different people, I think, out there in the camera land have probably different exposures to this, but I'll just give a little bit of a brief crash course. But there's a theory called the Theory of Relativity, which is not a theory at this point. We've pretty much proven that this is true, which essentially describes that according to how quickly you are moving, so the rate of time change actually varies. Which means, the most famous example that's used is, let's say I'm traveling very, very fast. So let's say I'm on a planet that's moving through space at close to the speed of light, just very, very fast. And you are moving on a planet that's moving at the same speed around the sun as our planet is currently moving at. So, and let's say we start off, we're the same age when we start this movement. So I'm racing around the sun, and you're moving at a regular pace of 365 days a year before you return to the same location in space relative to the sun, and I go way faster than that. And we start off, we're at the same age. So after, let's say 1 year of time has passed, so you'll have aged 1 year, and I will not have aged at all. And the longer that continues, incidentally, so what ends up happening is that I can go, the faster I go, so time will actually move completely, will essentially not move for me at all, and you will simply keep moving through time at your own rate, to the point where, like, after 1 million years, I'll still be exactly the same age, and time it'll feel for me as if like 1 day passed, whereas for you, literally, a ton of time, millions of years could have passed for you, and assuming that you're, have a way of staying alive, you'll just be millions of years old. There's been lots of movies made about this, a lot of books, written about this, and there's, a very famous recent movie that came out. It's a movie called Interstellar, where there's essentially a situation where people are thrown into a very high rate of speed, and then as a result, like for that group of people, like about a half an hour passes, but for people who are very nearby but are right outside of that high rate of speed, about, I think it's 30 years passes, which is like a crazy situation if you think about that. But like that, these are proven laws of physics that your actual experience of the measure of change, of unfolding change that we call time, actually is very fluid. It's not fixed at all. And what you think of as time as being like, well, it's just time. Time is like, it's an entity, it's a thing, and it just works a certain way. And like that does not exist. There's no such thing as that. Now, you're usually moving at a relatively consistent speed through space, right? We have a very stable existence. Our planet moves at the same speed through space all the time. Its rotations are relatively consistent, and the galaxy is relatively stable, moves at least as far as we're concerned right now in the small time that we are here. So it's moving in a relatively stable rate of speed. So you don't experience any of these comparable differences in time change and time rates because you don't have a situation where that's even relevant. You're usually moving at the same speeds. So for you, time feels very fixed, and we kind of need that. And it's a longer discussion as to why it's like that for us, and could it ever have been different? And that's an important thing to discuss also. But for our purposes right now, so you see very, kind of pretty clearly, once you learn some of these concepts, that actually the construct of time is in fact not a construct. it's almost not even an entity. It's simply a measure of change. And in itself, the measure of change will vary dramatically depending on your particular rate of speed. And even more than that, it actually will vary according to your frame of reference. Because think about what we just said. If I'm moving faster than you, then time moves slower for me than it does for you. Now, think about that, right? You'd think, well, but time is just time. It just moves, there's just an amount of time. So like, how could it be slower for me, but faster for you? And that was the biggest, new idea that was created, that was essentially discovered by Einstein, that actually, according to your frame of reference, according to your personal subjective perspective, the faster you're moving relative to the rest of the universe, so the slower time moves for you, even though it continues to move at a different rate for somebody else with a different frame of reference. So that's wild. The implications that are very undermining of the idea of time as a construct, because what that means is that depending on your particular perspective, where you are at relative to other things in the universe, how fast you're moving relative to the speed of light, that will actually make your experience of time completely different and other than mine. And so that really just shows you super clearly that there's no such thing as just like a fixed concept of time. And this is not like a random idea that we're like throwing in to apologetically solve a problem in the Chumash. I want you to understand, this is the real way of thinking about time. This is how scientists think about it. This is how it could, and the more you learn about it, the more you can start to sort of think about it this way more consistently. The more you can see the world through this lens, and it actually has very important implications in terms of looking at the world more objectively and clearly. And so when you know this is the truth, so then it's not that we have like the real truth, which is like, well, time is time, and you can't think of this too much because it's too confusing. No, time is just time. And then unfortunately, the Torah says that God created the world in 6 days, and like it doesn't really fit so well. That's why this whole thing is a straw man, because the idea that the Torah that God created the world in 6 days. So aside from the fact that we said the word Vayomer doesn't even mean that He spoke, but even ignoring that part for a second, the idea that God created the world in 6 days is a silly idea in terms of the truth. Because that's not really the default, that there's like just regular time, and then there's like, some other scientific idea that's just a random crazy theory. The actual truth is exactly the opposite. Real time and real understanding of time, the big picture of time, is far more bizarre and different than what we tend to think of in our very normal everyday usage of the word time. And we're lying to ourselves when we say that we're, just working with regular time. This is just time. Time is just, this stable thing that we feel happy with. That is not the truth. Now, you're welcome to use that, it's a partial truth, because you do experience time at the rate that you're used to. So you're welcome to live that way, in terms of a compartmentalized part of your mind, and say, well, I'm not going to think about this all the time. I recognize that time is actually much more than I realize. But at the same time, for a regular day-to-day life, I want to experience time the regular way. You're welcome to do that. But when you start letting that seep into areas where it doesn't belong, and it goes outside of its compartment and then conflicts with other truths, that's when you start running into problems like, but how could the Torah say God created the world in 6 days? It doesn't fit then. So that's why you have to learn deeper things to minimally be able to solve problems like that, so you understand truth. And maximally, it's like that should really become a much more mainstream way of thinking about time in your mind than just, oh, time is just this random thing that la-di-da, we kind of wander through time without really paying attention to the incredible, bizarre profoundness of this phenomenon that we are literally living all the time. So that's essentially, I think, the beginning of sort of like how to pull ourselves out of the human perspective on time and start to look at the world more the way that Hashem sees it. Because you have to remember, Hashem operates as the source of space and time. That's really the next point that we have to kind of unpack here, which is when we think about the Big Bang and the process of creation unfolding. So we tend to think about it in our terms, and that's really what I was saying before. It's like there's you and there's Hashem, and we're analyzing what Hashem did, and that's not what's going on here. It's not that Hashem is like, within time, and then there's just this thing called time, and Hashem just created now space and the universe, and He just magically did that. Hashem is not within time, because time itself is actually a construct of Hashem. In other words, whatever time is, if we assume that it's not a thing at this point, it's somehow this bizarre unfolding of process, we'll call it. It's the measurement of change. So that thing, whatever that is, that concept of process, the concept of change, the unfolding process, that is something which Hashem differentiated Himself into. Because if you don't say that, and you say that actually there's this thing called time, which even Hashem works within, well, that implies then that there's actually something which exists outside of Hashem. There's Hashem, and there's this thing called time, and Hashem just uses time, works within it. But our like when we talk about Hashem, so one of the core principles of the Torah's description of Hashem is that there is nothing which exists outside of Hashem. Hashem is called the Makom. He is the total context of all being. He's also called the Ein Sof, which means he is without end in any possible way, and all is contained within Hashem. Now, we're going to need to spend some time understanding that also. That's really going deeper then into, well, who is Hashem when he's doing these things, and how do we relate to Hashem? But in terms of just our understanding right now, so you have to realize that the idea that if you think about it as, well, God just decided to start creating, like time was kind of just going, and then right around here, God's like, oh, let's start creating now, and he creates things within time. That is a direct conflict to what the Torah is describing. Incidentally, that's in the text. We can actually see the signs pointing to the fact that time was something which Hashem generated as a function of the whole process of differentiation that we call creation. So that's a longer discussion also, which we're going to have to delve into at some other time. But what we're saying right now is that time itself is something which is also a construct. It's also a creation. It's also a differentiation of Hashem himself. It's not something which exists on its own. And so that really leads to the original problem here, which is very similar to what scientists essentially are struggling with their Big Bang theories, which is that when you go back in time, so if time is an unfolding process, measurement of change, of evolution of the universe, and you're kind of looking at it as like, well, the universe, if you look at the universe now, it's a certain size and it appears to be expanding based on different measurements that we're taking. And so what scientists do is they say, well, if you rewind that, you see that the universe will then be shrinking until eventually it's shrunk all the way down to this point, which is like the beginning point of the universe's evolving expansion of itself. And so at the beginning of that, so that's when time and space kind of burst into being. So the issue with that, of course, is that if time began then, and space began then, which is also what we claim, so like, what was there before that? And that's really where you start running into issues, right? Because like, how exactly do you, just like you can't talk about going outside of space and leaving the movie screen. You can't leave space because the concept of leaving only applies within space. You also can't talk about going back before time because there's no such concept of before when we're not dealing with time. Like the idea of before exists within time. But if time itself is simply a measure of the evolutionary change of the space universe that we're used to, well, when there's no space universe, there's also no time because there's no change. Nothing can change either. And so at that point, that ground zero, the beginning of the space, and then the time that is essentially the expansion of space, the change in space. So that ground zero point, so that's the beginning, but it's not just like a beginning like, well, in a linear way, there's this part, and it leads to this part, and this is the beginning of this part, and this is the beginning of this part. There's no before the beginning. So like, the word for beginning could be like the hatchala or like, barishon, like the first thing. But we have the word bereshit, which means like, this is the initializing. Like the word bereshit means in the initializing process. What you might call in philosophy the primal cause or the first cause. But those words don't capture it because first kind of like, it's like we can't conceive of idea of first without there being some kind of before that, some kind of cause. And so that's where you start really, your mind starts to break down because you try to think about, well, what was there before time? And it's kind of like, when you're on YouTube or Netflix and you have like, you want to do the 15 seconds backwards so you can back up and rewind a little bit. And it's like, let's say you're 10 seconds into the Netflix thing and you press back 15 seconds. So like, it doesn't go back 15 seconds. You're not at -5 of whatever it is you're watching. Like you're just at 0 because there is no before 0. There's no such thing as that. So the concept of before does not apply before 0. You just can't have that in time. And so time and space just unfold together because time is simply the measure of the unfolding of space. So there's just no way to think about that besides that. And that's when you really start to realize, well, okay, so just like science is grappling with this idea of like, well, where did the Big Bang come from? Where did the universe start to expand from? Like, what was that initial process? Like, what was going on there? And we have no idea. And in the scientific level, there is no knowledge of that. We have measurements and ideas about what the Big Bang was, and like I told you already in the previous video, we also have descriptions of the expansion of the universe from point A, ground zero, as well, that really mirror the descriptions of scientists from now, which is crazy just to think that from 1,000 years ago and 2,000 years ago, we have writings that describe the process of expansion of the universe that exactly mirror the Big Bang ideas they're just coming up with now using all of the different kinds of measurements that we have. But even ignoring that, The question is, how do we now think about the actual initializing process that Hashem essentially turns on in the beginning? So I just want to sort of give you one little tool and a piece of information just to sort of get the ball rolling in this discussion before we really turn our attention towards what I think what we call today evolution, because that's really the next part of the discussion here, and that's really what we're going to have to try to solve is like, well, what do we think about evolution? And like, if we talk about a universe that's expanding and that's 15 billion years old, and so like as opposed to the idea that you were just created as you are, so then instead there's this process of 15 billion years. So what is the Torah perspective on this concept that we call evolution? So that's what we're going to focus on in the next video. But just to sort of finish off this video, I just want to zoom in for a second on a particular formulation that we find, we find it in a few places, but I just want to sort of use it to show you how on the edge of your mind this whole thought process really is. So in Pirkei Avos, which is a part of the Mishnah and the Torah Shebaal Peh, the oral Torah that was given to us by Hashem at Har Sinai. So there's a line there which talks about how there's a bunch of different things that Hashem created in the beginning that needed to be created because there was no other way without Hashem creating them on their own individually. And one of the examples that's it's almost like amusing when you look at it and you read it there. It's tongs. Now tongs are tongs, like these tools. They're basically like this big piece of metal that you use to pull things out when they're hot. If you're barbecuing, you use tongs to pull meat off of the barbecue, and it's basically these two pieces of metal that are attached, and then you can kind of compress them together, and then they act to remove things that are very hot. And so when you make tongs, so the way they used to make tongs, the same way they used to make all metal workings, any kind of tools you're making out of metal. So you'd have to basically take metal and put it inside of a forge. Blacksmiths would do this, and then you superheat it. Then you pull it out of the forge, and then you have to use a hammer to basically beat it into the proper shape. Because when it's superheated, it gets very soft, and then you can change the shape to match whatever it is that you want the tool to actually look like. And so, in order to get the metal out of the forge, you need tongs because you can't touch the metal with your hands or you'll get burned, obviously. So the question is, how do you get the first set of tongs? Because the first set of tongs, well, you don't have any tongs to use to hold it and to get it out of the metal. So like you kind of have this problem, like you have hot metal inside a fire, no way to get it out and then start working on it. So the Torah said, the Pirkei Avos line seems to describe that Hashem created the first set of tongs, and then now we have tongs to make more tongs. So that's how it's usually taught, and that's it's a pretty simple way of describing what's going on. The tricky part there is, and if you actually read the line, it doesn't say that. It says that the first set of tongs was created with the first set of tongs. So think about that for a second. What does that mean? Like the tongs are created with tongs. That's what it says. Tongs are created with tongs. Like Hashem created the tongs with the tongs. So the issue there is that, well, if Hashem created the set of tongs with the tongs, so it sounds like what happened was, like, normally you'd have to have one set of tongs to create another set of tongs. But here what's happening is actually Hashem used the same set of tongs to create the first set of tongs. In other words, like the tongs that he created, he used them to create them. Okay? And that's a very strange thing. So like just to put that as like a problem. So let's go a little further for a second. There is a book written by the Ramchal. He's a Kabbalah writer from a few hundred years ago. The book is called the Klach Pischei Chachma, which means the 138 gateways of Chachma, doorways of Chachma. And Chachma means basic principles of reality. So he wrote a book with all these different types of principles. And in that book, he talks about one particular construct that I think is exactly what we just mentioned with the tongs, and describes the problem of thinking about the process of creation of Hashem when it's pre-time. So what he talks about there is that if you look at the world and the universe, the way it's structured is that the first phase of any attempt to create anything on the part of a person is you have to have what's called Rut Zone. And Rut Zone means, drive or will or impulse, like some kind of driving power. You have to want to do something. And then after you have that Rut Zone, that initial wanting, then if it kind of tracks through your thoughts and your nervous system and your emotions, and as you choose to express it, then you actually act upon that and express the underlying Rut Zone. So the ultimate action that you do essentially is expressing the initial wanting that drove it to start. So that's what Rut Zone means. Rut Zone is that initial wanting, and the Ramchal basically writes that there's, that we have Rut Zone. We use Rut Zone to initiate any process of development that we engage in. And then he talks about Hashem's Rut Zone, and he's like, well, the problem with Hashem's Rut Zone is that you can't be like, well, Hashem created the world and created the universe, differentiated the universe, whatever word you want to use. In order to do that, so there had to be Rut Zone initially to actually create reality, because that's the way that we are designed to mirror Hashem's way in terms of the universe. That's how we're designed, and Hashem designed himself in terms of his tools that he uses to create reality the same way. So he had to use Rut Zone to differentiate the rest of the universe. He had to start off with Rut Zone. So what's the problem with that? So the Ramchal writes, he's like, the issue is that even the Rut Zone itself, he had to use Rut Zone to create Rut Zone. In other words, Rut Zone is not just this thing which exists, the same way that we can't say that time is a thing which just exists and Hashem moves through time, because if you say that Rut Zone just exists, that means that now there's something which exists outside of Hashem. There's Rut Zone, and Hashem used some of that Rut Zone which exists in order to then create reality. You can't say that, because that means that now Hashem is not one, and there's something which exists outside of Hashem. So what that leads to is, so the Ramchal writes that it must be that actually Hashem created Rut Zone. But if he created Rut Zone, then he had to have Rut Zone to create Rut Zone, because you can't create things without an initializing spark that we call Rut Zone. So now you have a problem. So how did Hashem create Rut Zone without Rut Zone? You need to have Rut Zone to create Rut Zone, but if you already have Rut Zone to create Rut Zone, you already have Rut Zone anyway. So why are you creating it? So how does that work? It's like this impossible circle. Which one came first? And so the answer the Ramchal writes is this exact line of Pirkei Avos. What it says is that Hashem used the Rut Zone that he created to create Rut Zone. In other words, he created Rut Zone to create Rut Zone. And if you're confused by that and you're like, well, but which one created which one? The answer is the same one that he created is the one that he used to create that same one. And that's because when you think about Hashem, you have to understand that the way that Hashem operates is not the way that you operate. Hashem's logic is a broader meta logic, and we work within linear logic. So you are wired in terms of your mind. Your bina structures of your brain, what we call essentially the bulk of your regular thought in your mind, is what we call bina thought, which is where there's a lot of linear cause and effect structures. And Hashem has something which is beyond that. It's metalogical. And we're going to need to do a separate discussion just about that concept by itself. But for our purposes right now, so what you just need to realize is that when you think about it as like, well, which one is it? Like, which came first? Like, did this cause that? What caused this? The idea of causality itself is also just part of that universe of space-time that is unfolding. And when you're sort of stuck inside of the universe headspace and you're like, well, this is just what it is, so you are actually being blinded to the fact that there's something much larger here that you're not aware of yet. And you can learn about it, and not only can you learn about it, you can experience the meta logic of Hashem. And when you start to experience that, it's mind-blowing. But the point here is that the tongues are an analogy of Chazal, of the writings of our sages from thousands of years ago, to convey exactly what the Ramchal wrote 500 years ago about the order of events, which is that the idea of there being an order of process of events, of creation. So that's something which is true once you start the ball rolling and the Big Bang happens and things start to differentiate inside of the universe of space and time. But the initializing process of that is inexplicable using regular linear cause and effect language, perspectives, and tools. You simply can't use those tools because all of those tools, the idea of cause and effect and linear logic, are also all products of the space and time, reality that we're within. So you can't use those tools to apply them to beyond space and time. You can't do that. And so if you want to start thinking about Hashem, you got to think in a higher state of thought. And that's what the Torah calls metalogic, and the word for it in Hebrew is the word da'as, and we're going to have to delve into what that is. But I just want to end with one point for if you want to check out, I just put out recently a video about ahava, about love. And so I just want to say, as the conclusion to this video, that the easiest, the most direct way to experience that beyond the metalogical perspective of Hashem, that actually is the doorway into the creation process that we think of, which is, the initializing creation process. So is ahava, is what we call in English love. That's why everyone's obsessed with love, because they somehow intuit that this is like, this thing, love, doesn't belong here. It's like from outside. It's out of this world, like literally, it's literally just out of this world. And so that, that the experience of ahava in a real way, when you understand how to do it, which is exactly what the ahava video is about, so then you can actually touch the parts of reality that are beyond space-time, and you can touch a certain type of like timelessness and spacelessness that is the underpinnings of the initial process of creation, which we call the Big Bang. So that's basically the idea here. The Big Bang expansion process is within space-time and linear thought, and then the part before that is this. You can't think about it using your logical Bina side. You have to use a metalogical tool that you have to learn how to develop called the Das. And so that's really, how we start to talk about these things. And again, this is not like a random idea. This is these are central themes and principles and concepts of the Torah that are simply not taught very often, but they're like gigantic and super foundational. There's no way to understand the Torah without even, without knowing these types of things and without realizing these are like the core principles, as opposed to like just, in a much more superficial, shallow kind of way, just being like, oh yeah, there's time and how does it work and I don't know and whatever. So that's basically the idea that I'm trying to convey. I hope this was relatively clear, and I'm looking forward to seeing you guys on the channel. Check out the other videos, especially the Ahava one, and we will see where we go next in the evolution video, which is Big Bang Part 3.